Hello, and welcome to the Better Man Clinics, the podcast where we talk to actual experts about the questions that men want answered, but are either too embarrassed to ask or simply don't know who to ask. Before we get started, I do want to caution that the conversations on this podcast are for informational purposes only. They don't represent a medical consultation, nor do they present medical advice to individuals. Rather, we hope that the podcast empowers men with the knowledge and confidence to address these issues with their healthcare providers. As with any medical or wellness issues, you should always consult with your healthcare provider before beginning any type of treatment or preventative intervention. With that being said, in this episode, we discuss obesity. The U.S. is currently experiencing an epidemic of obesity, with over 40% of Americans grappling with this problem. But what is driving this obesity epidemic? Is it our Western diet, our sedentary lifestyles? Can obesity even be prevented, or is it simply a matter of genetics? Can we overcome obesity? And if so, what's actually been shown to work? Diet, exercise, medications? And to what extent is obesity an expected outcome of the onslaught of food marketing vying for our attention every day from print, TV, and of course, social media? In order to answer these questions and many more, we turn to a true expert. Dr. Travis Masterson is the director of the Health, Digestive Behavior, and Technology Lab at Penn State University, where he is an assistant professor in the nutrition department. Dr. Masterson earned his bachelor's and master's degrees in exercise science from Brigham Young University, and then completed his PhD in nutritional sciences at Penn State. He then served as a research fellow at Dartmouth University before returning to Penn State, where his research focuses on environmental food cues and their effects on eating behavior. Dr. Masterson is also a spokesperson for the Obesity Society. And now, without further ado, I bring you our conversation with Dr. Travis Masterson about obesity. Hello, and welcome to Better Man Clinics. Today, we're going to be discussing obesity, an issue that affects over 40% of Americans today. But what's really driving this epidemic of obesity? Is it just genetics, something we don't have any control over? Is it the fact that maybe we're leading more sedentary, inactive lifestyles? Or does it have to do with our diets, a lot of which is now kind of a more Western American type diet? And what can we do to overcome obesity? Is it just a matter of getting out there and going for more of a walk, being more active, or maybe joining a gym and starting an exercise program? Or does it really have to focus in on diet for weight loss? And with diet, does that mean starting a specific type of diet you hear about, whether it's low carb or intermittent fasting or plant-based or many of the others that are available? And how feasible is a diet when truly we're being bombarded with not only excessively available unhealthy food, but constantly bombarded with marketing about that unhealthy food, whether it be from billboards or TV or even social media? In order to answer these questions and many more, we're fortunate to be joined by a true expert. Dr. Travis Masterson, who is an assistant professor of nutritional sciences at Penn State University, and he's also director of the Health, Digestive Behavior, and Technology Lab there. Dr. Masterson, welcome to the program.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Wonderful, wonderful. So before we dive into the topic at hand, one thing I like to do with our experts is just to get to know them a little bit better. I'd love to know two things. One, what actually inspired you to study and go into the field of obesity and nutrition? And two, tell us a little bit about the exciting things you're doing in your lab.
Yeah, sure. So how I got started, I originally was going to school as like pre-med, pre-PT. And it just wasn't like the best fit for me. So I ended up in exercise science because that's like a gateway into those fields, right? And was trying to figure out what to do really. My original plan, honestly, so I was teaching martial arts in the evenings, going to school during the day, and was running a pretty successful studio as a manager. And having lots of fun. So I honestly thought that's what I was going to do, and really enjoyed, like interacting with people, working on health and fitness, those types of things. But towards the end of my bachelor's degree, I had a professor just approach me and say like, "Hey, do you want to try doing some research with us?" And I said, "Sure, I'll try it out, see what it's all about."
Why not?
And basically got hooked. So he ended up being my mentor during my master's degree. Um, and so yeah, I graduated with my bachelor's, my master's in exercise science. And I had been doing some projects using MRI, looking at brain response to food cues as part of that project in the exercise science department. And so looking to work on my PhD, I was trying to find labs that were doing similar things like food and MRI, mostly just because I knew that and I was kind of in it already and kind of wanted to keep going with it. And so that's what landed me originally at Penn State to do my PhD. Was that, and in doing so, I switched from exercise science to nutrition. But it was probably more around the behavioral aspects of it, like just trying to understand like why do people make the decisions that they make? Why do they like certain foods? Why are we drawn to certain things in our environment? Is kind of like where my interest was. I don't think I really set out and was like, oh, I need to be this ultra health professional about weight loss or anything like that, but it kind of naturally came together for me that way. And so since then, we've just been kind of looking at those types of things. And so that's kind of leads to I guess what my lab kind of focuses on. So for my PhD, I was doing a lot of work on advertising, branding, food commercials, and how they impact children's eating behavior. And I extended that into my postdoc. So I did a postdoc at Dartmouth for almost 2 years. And we were looking at very similar things. And so I kind of had this cross section through most of my graduate career and postdoc, where I've just been involved in advertising, food marketing, and specifically its role on eating behavior. And so the nice thing about food marketing is it's a natural extension into like food cues, because food marketing is like a type of food cue, right? It's like a very highly palatable food cue, kind of like an unrealistic food cue, right? And so that kind of allows me to extend out into that area as well, and just looking at food cues kind of in general. So a big portion of my lab is looking at food marketing. The marketing that we've been focusing on the most at the moment is influencer marketing. So we has been specifically looking at platforms like Facebook Live, YouTube Gaming, and Twitch, which is like a video game streaming website. And so we've just been looking at how prevalent marketing is on those platforms, what types of products are being pushed, what types of techniques are used, what are like users' perceptions of that advertising? Do they think that it influences them? Like those types of things. And then a little bit separate from like the food cue work that we do, we're also doing some work in virtual reality. So the technology part of my lab is utilizing different technologies to understand food cues. And so a big portion of my lab is an immersive virtual reality setup where we have people come into an immersive virtual buffet. And so we can get a food choice within that buffet because it's a hyper realistic buffet. They actually walk around our empty room, but they have the headset on and they're able to pick foods, and we're kind of able to see like how do they do that, why, different physiological responses while they're doing that, those types of things, without the need to make tons and tons of food to get that done, right? And so we're kind of in the process of validating a handful of different tools and paradigms to really get at that. But it's very exciting. Penn State's like a unique place for that because they recently just got a big team together that develops VR, and they're interested in our work. And so we're kind
That's
of riding that wave a little
It's
bit.
amazing. It sounds like some really exciting cutting edge work. And, we'll talk about the food cues and marketing a little bit later. I think where I want to start this conversation is kind of as one of my colleagues in medical school said, just the basics, right? So
Yeah.
with just in terms of understanding truly what obesity is to start off with, right? So I guess my first question is, how are you defining obesity? Is it just certain weight? Is it a weight to height? Like, what does obesity really mean to an expert like yourself?
Yeah, that's a really great question because yeah, there's different ways of kind of like measuring or classifying individuals. I think typically the way that I perceive it, or the way I think about it and talk about it, is when you're at a high body fat percentage. So it's more tied to that. So we have measures, or like kind of like measure adjacent type
Mhm.
things for body fat percentage, right? Because it's not totally feasible to get, you know, MRIs or DEXA scans on the entire population, right? So we can do things that are like quicker kind of screening tools, right? So that's where we use like height and weight to calculate BMI, or like waist circumference. Those are kind of like proxy measures, things that tend to correlate with body fat percentage, but obviously don't always. And so people that don't like BMI, or people that don't like those types of kind of screening measures, will always say like, well, if I was like a big bodybuilder and like my BMI would be really high, but I'd have really low body fat percentage. And it's like, okay, but like, yeah, I mean, that's true, but what actual percentage of the population is going to fall into that specific category? So generally those are good tools for screening, but that doesn't mean much beyond that, right? And so people get really caught up into those numbers and like my BMI should be this or that or whatnot. But really what those tools should be used for is for saying like, hey, your BMI is high. We should probably do some other tests. Like we should take your blood pressure. We should look at your cholesterol levels. We should, it's just kind of an indicator of like there might be other issues or problems going on because of your increased weight, or increased body fat percentage, right? And so we should probably take a look. And so that's where I look at it as more of like a screener rather than like a true categorization of individuals. Of everyone's going to fall neatly into these little buckets of BMI numbers or whatever.
Right, right, exactly. Travis, hold on one quick second. Sorry about that.
No, like we're my kids do that all the time when I'm teaching. Hey.
Oh yeah, it's the constant photo bomb. Luckily, we can edit that out, so that's good.
Yeah.
So going back to what you were saying in terms of screening, okay, I think that want to unpack that a little bit. First off, people still kind of want to get an understanding of, okay, well, if we're screening, kind of where do I fall in that line? So starting off with body fat. So you're saying that really the true marker of obesity is the percentage of your body that's fat, right? Is there, again, understanding there's variations or whatnot, is there some type of magic number that you look to say, okay, this above this you're considered obese?
Yeah, I mean, so like we use cut points, right? And so what those cut points are usually set around, whatever it is in like nutrition or health or whatever, right? Is that at a certain cut point, you tend to see an increase in problems, right? So when we're
Mhm.
talking about metabolic disorders, if your BMI is increased, then you have other occurring disorders or issues, then you become like metabolically unhealthy, right? And so again, it's not going to be that guaranteed like, oh,
Sure.
because your body fat percentage is this high, you're going to have XYZ problems, but it should point us in that direction. But we also know that because of the increased body weight, the likelihood of those issues come up, right? So like if you have a higher BMI, you're going to have higher blood pressure, typically higher cholesterol levels. You're going to have increased risk for heart disease, cancer, different things like that, right? And so that's where we start to have some concern. And so I think this is actually, I think this is actually a really important point, because a lot of people kind of in like the in general, like in the fitness and nutrition communities, you get a lot of like influencers or kind of like pseudo experts or gurus or whatever. And I feel like a lot of times their kind of focus comes down onto like aesthetic issues, right? So
Mhm.
they're like, oh, well, somebody wants to look a certain way or feel a certain way, or those types of things. But I think from like a scientific standpoint or medical standpoint, what we're really concerned about is the health implications of those things. And
Mhm.
so that's what we're really looking for is okay, what are these issues that go alongside with elevated weight or elevated body fat percentage, right? And then what can we do? Can we lower your weight and do those things go away? Yeah.
Yeah.
Can we do other things that help you have good health? Yeah. So that's what our focus is, not so much on like, oh well, you should be super skinny or you should be
Oh, of
super buff
course.
or like whatever.
Yeah. No, this is more, my question is more like, the guys listening, they probably want to get a better understanding of, okay, if I went to the doctor and, maybe they measured my height and weight. And again, just to clarify, BMI, body mass index, right? So it's just
Right.
a ratio of your height to your weight. Is that correct?
Right.
So like if somebody wanted to, a couple of scenarios, right? So if I go to the doctor and they tell me, maybe they don't even tell me what my BMI is, but they tell me like my height and weight, and I want to calculate what my BMI is to
Yeah.
say, you know what, should I be talking to them about, should I be concerned more about high blood pressure or cholesterol or whatnot? What as a typical guy is that BMI that, like, yeah, I understand there's different cut points, but like where you might be concerned, for instance.
Yeah, so I think, like the typical way that we stratify and break it up is we'll look for individuals that are considered like overweight,
Mhm.
which is where, so it's a BMI of 25 or higher. And
Mhm.
then obese is going to be 30 or higher, essentially. And so those are like good cut points. But again, that's where like sometimes individuals get really like they're in the overweight category, perhaps they're like metabolically healthy otherwise, and so sometimes people start to like freak out a little bit about that and say, well, I need to do something drastic, when in reality you could probably do smaller things, right? And again, it goes back to, yeah, like maybe you're a bodybuilder and you go and you calculate your BMI, and it's not going to be problematic because you're healthy otherwise, and you know that a lot of it's muscle or whatnot. So but yeah, so definitely if you're pushing up into that obesity category, um then that's when you really want to start paying attention and and really start talking to your doctor, talking to a dietitian, those types of people to try and help you understand what's going on, understand how weight gain is affecting you, what you might do to be able to like stop that weight gain or even reverse it, right?
Sure. And just for perspective, so for somebody with a BMI of 30, if you're talking about an average guy of, let's say, 6 feet tall, right? Maybe that's a little bit higher than average, but just a round number. What kind of weight is that, generally speaking?
For a BMI of 30,
Yeah.
that's a good question. You can calculate it pretty quick. On NH and the CDC both have like pretty simple calculators. So in feet and pounds, so whoops, my guess would be right about there. Yeah, so I put in 6 foot to 250. That's a BMI of 33. Um,
So around
yeah,
somewhere in 230 to 50. So yeah, I mean, it's just to give people
240, 250.
perspective of what that means for sure. And
Yeah.
you had mentioned waist circumference. Is that something that you look at as a I guess qualifier or disqualifier in that sense?
Yeah, so the reason that waist circumference or waist to hip ratios, those types of things are helpful. They're actually typically a better indicator of health than just be straight BMI, and it has
Okay.
to do because you can tell where the weight is more distributed, right? So one of the reasons that fat body fat becomes problematic is because fat is actually a metabolic tissue. So a lot of people think of it as kind of inert, like it's just sitting there storing energy or whatever. But it's actually very metabolic and is sending out lots of hormones and signals and different things like that. And so when that is closer to your organs, like in the abdominal area, then it's going to increase the risk of disease because it's impacting all the vital parts of your body.
Right.
And so and sending signals out all over the place, right? And so that's where waist circumference, those types of things are helpful because you can see where the fat is distributed. and that gives you a better idea of the risk that you might incur due to the weight that you put on. And so like if you're carrying the weight in your hips more, or if you're carrying it in your shoulders more, it's going to be less problematic than if it's in your gut, right? So a lot of people say like, well, why don't we just do waist or circumference on everybody?
Yeah.
And it's because it's not nearly as easy, right? Like it's much easier to get height and weight. You've got to take off your shirt, you got to wrap a measuring tape around your stomach. You have issues on like, well, how tight do you pull it? Where exactly are you placing it? Like, just all sorts of like little things that tend to take up a lot of time in a doctor's office and take time to train and those types of things. So yeah, so it's just easier just to do height and weight and screen from there, I think, in a lot of ways.
Got it. Now, the obvious question that people have, and you alluded to some extent, is why do we even care, right? You had mentioned that, obesity might be associated with high blood pressure or maybe high cholesterol, but can you quantify to some extent how much does obesity contribute to bad health outcomes? Do we have any data to ascribe to that?
Yeah, you're like taking me back to my classroom days. Yeah, I mean, so it definitely there's data showing like what your percent increase in risk of different diseases are, right? But we definitely know that it's going to be associated with things like heart disease because of elevated blood pressure, elevated cholesterol, cancers, diabetes, those types of things, right? And so it's percent contribution or the amount that it increases your risk. I don't know off the top of my head.
Fair enough.
But yeah, so most of these chronic diseases, though, it's going to impact that quite substantially.
Got it. So heart disease, you mentioned blood pressure, cholesterol. I'm assuming diabetes is impacted as well. I know I had talked to an orthopedic surgeon a while back who mentioned also problems with knees and joints and arthritis, all those kind of things impacting as well. So definitely a reason to tackle it, the problem for sure. Now in terms of causes, how big of a role does genetics play in obesity? Because some people will say that, you know what, I was predetermined to be this weight. Maybe my parents are bigger, maybe my siblings are bigger. I can just bang my head against the wall. It's not going to change anything. This is who I'm going to be. Do we have any data to determine like to what extent genetics play a role in this?
Yeah, for sure. We know that genetics play quite a significant role. The main way we know that is through twin studies. So if you're looking at twins who share genetic profiles, the variation, if you put them under different conditions between them and somebody else, is much tighter than somebody that doesn't share their complete genetic profile or whatever, right?
Sure.
When we do genetic studies where we're looking at specific SNPs in the genome, that is like less clear, right? So like we can't attribute so much about obesity to like one gene per se. So it's probably a wide range of genes that influence it, and for a variety of different reasons. So maybe metabolism, maybe where weight gets distributed, how it gets distributed, how fast it gets distributed. So at Dartmouth, we were looking at genetic markers for reactivity to cues in your environment, those types of things. So genes are definitely part of that. The big thing that comes up is exactly what you were saying, is when sometimes what I've seen kind of two reactions to when you tell people like genes are very influential in weight. One is what you said, is like, well, it's that predeterminism, right? Like I have no control over this. It's my genes, and there's nothing I can do about it. Right. And I don't think that that's really the case. The flip side of that is you can also get people that say like, oh, this isn't my fault. And that relieves a lot of like the stress and shame, or, like guilt, or like whatever feelings that they've kind of concocted about where they're at. And so like, it's kind of a double-edged sword in that way, right? I think the correct way to kind of look at it is to say like, okay, I understand that this is going to be more problematic for me, or that it is maybe something I need to spend some more time looking at. Genetics also helps us to see if like, well, maybe medications will help certain people, or certain treatments might help certain people more than others, right? And so rather than just kind of putting one treatment out that should fit everybody, we can kind of tailor treatments and say like, hey, you might struggle more with cues in your environment. You might struggle more with this. You might benefit from this medication over this medication, those types of things, right? So that's the way I think I typically look at genetics, is that it helps inform us, and it gives us more information about what might be going on with ourselves in the environment that we're placed into, right? That doesn't take away, your ability to make choices or to work on something. Does that kind of make sense? So
Yeah.
it's
So, I mean,
not like
I guess you're saying this is not like obesity is not necessarily a life sentence based on your genetics. You have agency to overcome it to some extent, at least, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so then hopefully what that would lead you to do is to try and investigate that a little bit and say like, okay, like this is a problem for my family. My family's typically been very big. They've had heart disease, they've had diabetes, they've had these things. I'm going to take it upon myself to improve that, for me and my future and my kids or my family or whatever it might be, right? And say like, this is going to be something that I concern myself with and that I work on. It doesn't mean that you have to become some bodybuilder or some, movie star or something like that. It's just saying like, hey, I'm going to check these things. I'm going to work on this. I'm going to see if I can improve my diet. I'm going to see if I can do some more physical activity. I'm going to, modify some like what my family typically does if they, ate certain things or sat around a lot or, like those types of things. I'm going to try and adjust those behaviors and modify them
Right.
to improve. So.
No, that's a great way to look at it, right? But it's kind of flip it on the positive side, like, what, I know I'm at risk, so I'm going to be more proactive to see, because there are things I can do to counteract my risks, basically.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like if you have family risk for developing cancer, right? It's not like, yeah, so you might be at higher risk, but you don't just give up and say like, well, I'm going to get cancer. You say like, okay, I'm going to do early screenings. I'm going to, make sure I'm following proper diet or whatever for whatever my condition might be, to try and reduce my risk, right? And so, yeah.
No, it makes total sense. Now, another thing you hear a lot about is that, well, people are just obese because they're sitting around the couch watching Netflix, right? They're just not active. And if they just got up off the couch, then, everything would go away. All the obesity would go away and everyone would be skinny. So the question is not, obviously, I simplified that quite a bit for obvious reasons, but the big question I have, I guess the first question I have is that, first, to what extent is obesity tied to physical inactivity? How big of a role, I guess, does activity play in staving off obesity?
Yeah. It's a good question. Before that, I do want to say like that mindset is actually very prevalent of like, well, if somebody has obesity, if somebody has elevated weight, elevated body fat, something like that, right? Like they must be lazy, right? That's like the go-to, which I've always found so like, it's just baffling to me that people even think that, because like you'll look at people who are highly successful, people that go to med school, people that own businesses, people that are, these people obviously have discipline. They obviously have the ability to delay gratification. They obviously have, the education, like those types of things, right? So those kind of thought processes just they've never made sense to me. And so yeah. So sorry, I just wanted to like throw that out there first.
It's an important point.
Yeah. Okay. So then from the physical activity side, so yeah, the impact that physical activity has on weight loss is minimal, or even non-existent. So the data that is out there has shown that it's not a driving force in weight loss. So in shorter term studies, if you get somebody to exercise, like force them to exercise, and then you monitor what they eat afterwards, what we see is that they tend not to compensate immediately. Meaning like, so if I burned off 200 calories, it's not like I go to my dinner and then I eat exactly 200 calories more to make up for it. But actually, that is what we see kind of over time, is that if you kind of impose activity on people long term, they'll adjust their intake over time. And so there needs to be some sort of like dietary control in there as well. But the other thing that a lot of people just don't consider is that like activity, like physical activity, is just not that large a percent of the energy that your body's using in your day, in your everyday life, right? So, you know, when we're talking about like normal people, because when you say that, and then you're like, well, you could be Michael Phelps and he's eating 13,000 calories a day or something like that, and it's like, yeah, well, he's also swimming for like eight hours a day.
Right.
So who's really doing that? Like, I think most of us are like looking at, on good days, maybe a half hour to an hour of physical activity that we're able to fit in. And so like in that time period, you're just not going to burn that many more calories above and beyond what you do. And then once you do that, so like if I'm pretty consistent about exercising every day, like which I am, right? Then what happens is my body adjusts to that. And so for me to continue to lose weight, I have to either increase the amount of time that I'm spending exercising, or I have to increase the intensity significantly. And so it's just not going to give me the kind of like exponential growth in energy burn that I really need, right? And so for those reasons, I'd say it can, like, you can get some small amount of weight loss, but it's not going to be the same, because like for example, to drop like 200 calories from your diet is much easier. You just drop a Pepsi or a couple Oreos out of your diet, and that's much easier than spending an extra half hour exercising or increasing your intensity substantially, right? um and you can kind of continually cut calories out of your diet to some extent, right?
Right.
Yeah, so when I say that, it really, I found like students and just other people, it really bothers them, because that's kind of like a trope that's been fed consistently in the fitness industry, right? Is like, you want to look great, you want to lose weight, come work out, come buy our gym membership, come buy our program, come buy our
Right.
all this kind of stuff. And because again, it's that very like in the media, it's all about physical appeal, it's all about the look, the aesthetic, right? And so they really play into that and play that up, to generate business and generate buzz and get people really, excited about doing it, because yeah, I want to lose 50 pounds and look amazing, and all this kind of stuff, right? So yeah, so it's very shocking to people when they hear that. And what they hear, what I find that they hear often, is that I'm saying that physical activity is not important.
Right.
And that's not what I said, right? I just said it's not tied to weight loss per se, right? It's not going to be the driving force behind your weight loss, I guess is the better way to say it, right?
Mhm.
It's important for so many other things though. Like if you're talking health, then exercise is vital, right? Because we're talking about like, okay, functionality of the body, being able to walk around, being able to move, being able to stretch, being able to pick things up, being able to carry your kids around, being able to play soccer, being able to do all these things on top of like, well, we know better cardiovascular health is going to increase outcomes with heart disease. You'll have, less cancer. You'll have better management of your diabetes. Like all of these other things. And
Yeah.
so it's like, it's so baffling to me that people are like, it has to be tied to weight for
Right.
it to be beneficial. I'm like, well, it's beneficial for its own reasons. Why do we have to tie it into weight per se?
Right.
Now, for weight maintenance, though, it seems to be one of the most important things. And
What do
that's
you
probably
mean?
for
Let me interrupt you. What do you mean by weight maintenance?
yeah. So after losing weight, keeping that weight off. So what we typically see with people when they lose weight is they'll do some sort of diet, some trendy diet or something like that, right? And they'll lose a bunch of weight, 5 to 10% in like 6 months. So they lose 10, 15 pounds, right? And which is great. That's very important. But what we see is they get to 6 months, they probably more or less tire of being on the diet, because it's unreasonable expectations that they set for themselves, and they start to go back into some of their old behaviors. But yeah, so when you get to that bottom half though, and if you're able to get a diet that you can be consistent with, that you're happy with, that you can kind of do long term, and you're keeping the weight off, usually what we see in individuals that do that, they also tend to exercise pretty consistently. And so there's probably something going on there where the exercise is helping you to either give you kind of like a fudge factor in terms of like maintaining your calorie load, or it's probably a behavioral signal that's showing like, hey, I'm very committed to what I'm doing in terms of my health outcomes, right? I'm trying to stay healthy, whether that's from losing weight or from exercising. I'm kind of getting this package. And so, yeah, so we see it highly correlated to weight maintenance. And it's important for that, I think. And yeah, so.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and I think sure it's a big surprise for a lot of people. It's that you're not going to exercise your way out of obesity, but potentially you can maintain your weight loss, which is also very critical because you don't want to bounce right back.
Right.
So, based on what we've been talking about, while things have an impact, it really comes down to diet in terms of losing weight out of obesity. So. Basic question again, is there an ideal amount of food that people should consume on a daily basis? Not, let's say, to lose weight, but let's say to maintain a healthy weight.
Yeah, so basically, so I think an easy way to think about it is, and this is an oversimplification, right? But essentially, the amount of calories that you eat per day will determine your weight, and the amount of exercise that you do will determine whether that weight is held as fat or as lean tissue, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, there's pretty good mathematical modeling out there showing, like, based on your height, weight, age, sex, all those kinds of things, what weight you'll be for a given calorie intake. And there's going to be some variation in there, right? But yeah, so you can target different calorie intakes based on what weight you essentially would like to sit at, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, so it's a hard question what you're asking, is because, like, I don't know, what weight do you want to be?
Right.
Where do you feel comfortable? Where can you adjust your habits to where you're happy, right? Both with like your mental health as well as your physical health, right? And so so yeah, I think determining that is like a very kind of personal issue for a lot of people, of saying like, okay, this is where I want to be. What a lot of people do is they give themselves maybe too low of a target. So they're like, I want to be the weight I was when I was in high school, or something like that. And you're like, what, like 20 years ago when
Mm-hmm.
you were still growing, like, but they get this kind of like ideal weight. And so I'd say that's the problem that I see the most with individuals is setting like kind of like an unrealistic weight expectation. So again, then it goes back to, like, you can kind of use like a BMI scale to say like, okay, where can I kind of sit with my height? What weight should I be? And then how many calories does that correlate to? And again, the NIH has like a really nice tool for that, where you can kind of plug some of that in and see like, oh, okay, if I'm eating this many calories, what would my weight be? And as well as kind of projecting out like how long it will take you to hit a certain weight by restricting your calories by a certain amount, those types of things. So,
And depending on what and it takes into account, I should say, obviously what your weight is currently.
correct. Yeah. So you put in your current weight, your height, your age, your sex, and then what your current weight is, what your target goal would be, and then it'll calculate like, well, how many calories do you need to cut your diet by to be able to hit that? And I'd say it's like fairly accurate in being able to predict what you should do. So.
Perfect. So, maybe what we'll do is we'll get that website from you. We'll put it on we'll put it on our site so that people can click it and have access to it.
Yeah, I think it's a great tool to just go in and just play around with a little bit, because it'll give you like I found it's like one of those things where you can kind of mess with it and see like, oh, if I increase and you can put things like physical activity in and stuff. So, and it really gives you an idea of like, oh, this is how much energy physical activity is going to burn. This is how much cutting my diet by this would do. Like how long should it take me to hit this weight? Like those types of things. And it gives people more of an intuitive sense of what they're looking at. Because a lot of people just go off of like old rules, like where it's like, oh, cut 500 calories and you'll lose a pound a week or whatever. And it's like,
Right.
Well, that's not totally true. That's not like how it really works, because your body is adjusting how much energy it needs as you're losing weight and stuff like that. And so this tool helps you kind of see kind of more like the dynamic relationship that your body has with energy and weight. So yeah, so I'd highly recommend just playing around with it.
Well, that's for the National Institute of Health website, but we'll include that link on there so people can go and play with it and get a better understanding. Now, when it comes to foods, and we talked about calories, which obviously is the lowest common denominator there, right? But are all foods created equal in terms of contributing to obesity? If we're taking calories across the board, holding calories static, right? Like 500 calories of one thing versus 500 calories of another. Does it make a difference what you're eating?
Yeah, it's like a loaded question, right?
Uh-oh, watch out.
No, but it really is in a way a loaded question, because it's what are you talking about when we're talking about health and being healthy, right? If we're talking purely about weight, which again is that thing where like people always equate weight and health, right? If we're just talking solely about weight, then yeah, it's just the calories, like wherever you're getting those calories from. You know, if we're talking about like what we want to hit, like our we want to optimize maintaining lean mass, or if we want to make sure we're getting all of our micronutrients, or if we want to kind of like eat the foods that help us to be more psychologically happy, or you know, like those types of things. It's like that's a totally different question, right? And so it really comes down to like, well, what are kind of your goals? What are your expectations? What are you willing to do or not do to hit a certain goal, right? So in terms of weight loss, I don't think that there really is an optimal diet. So when you look at like big meta-analyses of like weight loss and different diets, you don't see a big difference between diets once they're kind of like equated for calories and energy intake, right? So if I do a low-fat diet or low carb diet, Mediterranean diet, paleo diet, whatever. If we take into account just like, well, what's the energy intake for these groups, they seem to come out just about the same. And so, you know, like there's always some stuff where like, so they're like very low carb diets, they'll be a few pounds lighter than like a low fat diet, but it all comes from like the lean component of the model rather than the fat component. So, you know, so like, it's just, are those like meaningful differences? Probably not.
Right. So yeah, I mean, like, so what you're saying, I guess, is that like, again, from a weight loss perspective, calories are calories. They don't care where you're coming from, but there's a lot more health factors to consider, I should say, based on what you're ingesting.
Yeah, exactly, 100%. And so then you can go in and look at your macronutrient distributions, right? And it's like, yeah, so we can look at probably the most studied and probably the diet that has the best kind of outcomes across the board is the Mediterranean diet. And basically what that diet is, it's like a lower carb, a higher fat, a little bit higher protein, but it has some basic principles in there. There's like very little added sugar in that diet. There's very little saturated fat in that diet. Right. So you could do that, or you could go with the low carb diet if that helps. And so like a lot of people get caught up in kind of like this optimal mentality of like, there's this one way to do it. There's this one way of like living your life that's optimal, or one way of eating, which again it's one of those things that's a little bit baffling to me, because it's like, well, you realize like all throughout human history, there's different diets, there's different ways of approaching things, there's different foods that people like, different cultures like, there, you know, like all these kinds of things. So to assume that there's only one right way to do something, I think is a little bit short-sighted. And so then those are the factors that I think are important to kind of get into, is like, okay, well, are there foods that make you happy? Are you just going to restrict that and just be miserable the rest of your life? Are there foods that are important to your culture? Are there foods that are important to your family? You know, like those types of things. Then there's things that are just kind of like good principles to abide by, right? Like, yeah, we should reduce added sugars. We should reduce saturated fat. We should make sure we're getting a good amount of protein in the diet, right? Like those are things that 100% are going to help, and that could be focused on regardless of the dietary pattern that you want to have, right? So you can do low carb and have a low saturated fat intake. It's totally possible, right? You could do the Mediterranean diet and have a super high saturated fat intake if you pick just the right foods to really mess up the diet, right? Like, do you know what I'm saying? And so
Totally.
yeah, so it's kind of looking at that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, I tend to think like, let's look at these general principles that we know kind of work, and then figure out what works for you. So some people, I really do believe that for some people, really restricted diets work for them. It helps them for whatever reason, whether it's psychological or the simplicity of it, or just being able to remove themselves kind of from like the typical food environment, or whether maybe it just gives them a feeling of moral superiority, like whatever it is, it really does work for them. And anecdotally, there's people that are like, if I eat this, it makes me feel like I have to keep eating this or that or whatnot, right? And so I think those are important things for each person to consider. But to then go out and say like, well, my experience generalizes to everybody else, I don't know if that's like the best takeaway from what's going on there, right? Yeah. So sorry, I know there's a little bit of a rant.
No, it actually makes a lot of sense, because, we were going to talk about, and what we just talked about now really is in terms of like, is there an optimal diet? It sounds like there isn't one. It's what's optimal for you. It's what works for you, what you can be on long term in a sustainable way without kind of bouncing back. And as long as you keep I'm assuming as long as you keep in mind that some diets, some of the fad diets out there just aren't good for you, right? I mean, there's
exactly. Or like, there's bad ways to do those types of diets, right? I guess is another way to say it, because I do think, I think again, there's probably healthy ways of doing a lot of different diet patterns, but and so that's where like we get into a lot of like I don't know, there's a lot of pseudoscience type stuff out there. And so what is really bothersome to me is just when people are just making lots of claims that are unsubstantiated, that they're twisting the science, that they're basing their recommendations to the public off of like hypotheses rather than actual data, like those types of things, right? And not, I don't think everybody out there is just malicious and like that kind of stuff, but there's definitely some bad information out there. So that's actually, so I'll make a plug for I work with redpenreviews.org, and we do scientific reviews of popular diet books. And so what we do is, rather than review the writing, which is what normally is done, so like if you go to Amazon, it'll be like, oh, this book has 5-star reviews and it's well written and like that kind of stuff. Well, that doesn't mean that it's a scientifically sound book, right? It just means somebody's really good at telling a story, basically. And so what we do is we look at it from the science side of things, and we try and pick apart the book and see what can we actually find out. What we find out a lot with those books is that their citations aren't very great. They'll cite something, but it doesn't actually support what they're saying, that they misinterpret studies, they kind of exclude looking at the broader literature. So they're basically like cherry picking studies that fall within what they believe or what they're trying to sell, essentially. And then, like, it makes sense. What a lot of times is going on is they're trying to sell their book, their platform. So they might have like coaching that goes along with it. They might have a support groups. They might have supplements. They might have, like all these kind of things. And so, they're trying to push people to do that. And so the way to do that is to say, well, I figured it out. Nobody else is smart enough. Come with me. Yeah. And
that was
again,
called,
it doesn't.
Sorry, that was called Red Pen Reviews.
redpenreviews.org. Yep.
Got it. We'll include that as well. And it sounds like a great resource, because you can really, sift through it, because it is hard to know. For a common layperson, they're not going to go in and check sources and go back to the source information and review studies. That's very hard to do.
Yeah, I was gonna so we specifically try and write it for like a general audience, so it's a little bit more accessible than like a scientific paper. But we started doing this, I guess, probably like 2.5, 3 years ago, I think. And there's a group of us that kind of write these reviews. They're very time consuming to do, because you have to read the whole book, and then you have to really hone in on certain arguments. You have to go look at the literature. You have to read the papers. You have to like really understand what the paper's saying, like what they're doing, those type of things. It's very time consuming. And so, I mean, it's not surprising that people can do this and like just write kind of whatever they want, throw a citation in there, and it's kind of a hard thing to catch. I think if you're not aware of the literature at large. So
for sure. And speaking of not being aware, regardless of what kind of diet that you choose, you are always going to be faced by a couple of things, right? One, there's an overabundance of food, a lot of it bad food. Another one is all of the marketing that goes with it. Before we get to the marketing point, I want to ask your thoughts on something that I heard from another guest on the show a few weeks ago, where he mentioned the concept of a bliss point of tastiness, where food companies are actually like engineering processed food. I'm assuming, obviously, you can't engineer a tomato, but you're engineering processed foods to the point of reaching this bliss point where people just need to eat more and more of it. Is this a thing? And can you elaborate? Can you help explain it a little bit?
Yeah, so I think the idea of the bliss point is, it's been around for a while. So so I work with on some projects with John Hayes here at Penn State, and he's a sensory scientist. So I've seen him talk about this quite a bit. So a lot of people think this is like a new concept, but I think he said there's people talking about this back before 1930, even maybe like,
oh, wow,
pretty old. And the other thing is, like, it's really not a new concept. If you go to the artistic side of nutrition, which is cooking, right? Chefs, they've known this forever. That's how they sell food, right? Like that's forever old.
right.
So bliss point is basically where you can encourage somebody to eat something because of how tasty it is. I think the idea in general is, for example, like with sweetness, right? So like the sweeter I make something, the more you'll like it, right? Well, actually, no, right? Because if I give you something super, super sweet, it could be sickly sweet, right? To where you're just like, this is like, oh, it's like overly sweet, right? Like I can't stomach this anymore. And so that's what the bliss point is basically where it's like, how can you increase the liking and acceptance of something and get it to the maximum amount of liking before it tips over to the other side and becomes kind of gross.
Right.
And so, so you can do that with sugar, fat, combinations of things, flavors, those types of things. And so I think that this idea of bliss point isn't, like I said, isn't new. It's been around for a long time. I think the problem is that it can now be mass produced at that level. So whereas before you'd have to like go to a fancy restaurant or have like a really great cook or chef in your house or a baker or something like that, right? Who really understood how these things kind of balance out. Now you can have somebody figure it out and then you can mass produce it. And it's so easy to get to, right? And so that's the idea behind like ultra processed foods, is they're foods that are hitting this kind of like quote unquote bliss point, right? Of like their maximum amount of fat and sugar in them. They taste super good. They're easy to eat. There's no fiber or little water in there at all, right? So easy to eat and get in, and it's everywhere. So it's at your grocery store, it's at your gas station, it's at your like I was just at clothing store the other day. There's junk food at the checkout there.
Because why not?
Like, yeah, no, exactly. Why not? And then not only that, but it's thrown in your face all the time, right? And that's where the marketing component comes in, of like you're constantly being reminded about that type of food. So
let's talk about that for a minute. So at the beginning of our chat, you mentioned the concept of food cues. Can you share like what that is and how those cues may influence what and how much we eat?
Yeah, so food cues are essentially just anything that triggers like a drive to eat, essentially, and or seeking out the drive to seek out food even. So it can be a wide variety of things. So the most obvious one I think is the sight of food, right? So like you see food in your environment, you're going to be drawn towards it and be like, I'm going to taste that, right?
Yeah.
But I think one that people kind of understand implicitly is like, if you smell cookies baking, you don't see them, but you're definitely going to go into the kitchen and see what's going on, right? So that's a food cue too. There's other food cues like we could talk about, like maybe the time of day, maybe different social situations, maybe the time of year. Certain foods become appealing to you because it's the holidays or whatever, right? Yeah, it might be the crinkle of a bag or the crunch of a chip, right? So like all of these can serve as cues, basically trying to inform you about like what is in your environment, what types of foods are in your environment, and maybe even give you contextual clues about like how energetic they're going to be, like how much energy is going to be in them, how tasty they are, like those types of things, right?
Mhm.
And so yeah, food cues are really important because from like an evolutionary standpoint, because food was fairly scarce throughout most of human history until basically recently, like since the 1950s, right? And so being able to seek out food and identify foods that are going to give you energy that you can eat, that you can consume, right, is a very important skill for humans to have, right, to be able to survive. And so that for example is where like I think the genetic component of that is like we are a species that have gotten really, really good at finding and consuming food, so that when we go through periods of famine or different things like that, and storing energy, right? Storing that food, so that when we go through periods of famine or sickness or different things like that, that we can survive those periods. But now we're in an environment where it's everywhere. The cues are everywhere. The food is everywhere. It's impossible to get away from, and it's super easy to get. It doesn't even cost anything, right? It doesn't even cost you don't even have to go harvest anything. You just go pick it up off the shelf and you're ready to go, right? And so that to me is like the big issue there is like no one's genetics are doing anything unexpected. I don't think. It's just that we're in an environment that we haven't really been in before as a species, where there's just massive amounts of food, and so that's where you kind of see the difference between like underdeveloped countries and more developed countries, right? As like they start to get more food in the environment and they get more processed foods and those types of things, their weight starts to rise just like everybody else. So it's like, well, are genetics like super different? I don't think so. I think they're just doing what humans do, which is seek out food.
For sure. For sure. Now, obviously it's one thing to walk into your kitchen or walk into your house and smell cookies and go to the kitchen, but to my understanding, in the media, food cues are being kind of, I guess, manipulated in a marketing perspective to get us to eat more in specific kind of foods. Can you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, we call it like food porn. there's whole like Instagram threads on with that hashtag, right? Yeah, because basically like have you ever gotten a burger that looked exactly like it did on the commercial, or that like on the little menu that you're looking at before you buy it? No, it's like it's not even ever close, right? There's also funny Instagram threads about that where it's like the commercial versus the reality.
Right.
Yeah. And yeah, so I mean that's what you're seeing, where you're seeing like a really fake food presented on an advertisement. So whether it's like a print ad or a television advertisement or something on the internet, right? Like those depictions of the food are not real, and they're basically sexed up, right? It's like they get some extra sheen on there. They make the pickles look just right. They make the fries extra crispy. A lot of that's paint and gloss and like all sorts of weird. There's whole professions around just making this food look like super appealing, and making it just right. And so yeah, so it's not a realistic cue. There's actually a debate. This is kind of a tangent, I guess, in the scientific community, where people were saying that food advertisements were a naturalistic cue because they're a cue that you encounter in your natural environment or whatever. And somebody actually was like, no, they're not a naturalistic cue. Like you never see anything like that in the real world. It's not.
It wouldn't just be that attractive. Like you wouldn't say, I don't need that if you saw it in real life, right? Versus,
yeah, you'd be like, oh, okay, it's like a crappy burger. Yeah.
So how can, if all of this food marketing and these cues are pretty ubiquitous, are there strategies that people can use to overcome these marketing efforts?
Yeah, this is tough. I think first is just being aware of it is important. Like, just knowing that it's there, knowing becoming aware of how often it is. Like, you start to like if you everyone listening to this should just start paying attention to like when you're on, listening to music on whatever service you use or whatever. you'll start to hear, oh, like every time I get a commercial break, there's at least one food ad in there. On TV, on the internet, like you'll start to see these ads pop up. My lab, since we do all this kind of stuff, we are constantly just taking snapshots of like internet pages just full of ads. So I have like a huge folder just full of different snapshots of ads and stuff like that. Because yeah, it's really everywhere. So being aware that it's there, but I don't think that being aware of it is the only solution. So anecdotally in my lab, we find that yeah, we really want to eat after we've been doing an ad analysis.
I can imagine
So,
it's occupational hazard.
yeah, so we or our food queue work where we're showing pictures of like really appealing foods in the MRI or different things like that. We're always like super hungry afterwards. And,
Right.
we monitored an ad campaign for a chain restaurant, and afterwards we were all like, oh, we should probably go get some food there because it's effective. But it's effective. Like what that marketing is, it's effective. And it's behavioral manipulation, right? Like we know. And what I found is like when you tell adults, when you're like, yeah, you're being manipulated. No, I'm not being manipulated. Like, no, there's no way. Like I yeah, no, they got you. Like, don't worry.
Right.
They're not spending millions, billions of dollars like throwing ads out because it's not affecting you or whatever. Like it's doing something to you. And so yeah. So then that leads us to like, okay, then what do you do about it?
Yeah.
I think that the first thing is you can just avoid it, right? So like whenever possible. So use paid for services that avoid ads in general, just in general, like pay for your music subscription, pay for your streaming content, like those types of things. But that's a very elitist position to take because like most people can't really do that. Maybe they'll have discretionary funds for like one or two things, but a lot of like low, especially like in lower income populations, it's not reasonable. Like they're just not
Right.
going to be able to do it. And
Right.
I know it's like hard for some people to wrap their heads around, but it's not feasible. Some people don't have the extra $5 a month to do that, and so to just be like, oh, well, just pay your way out of advertising is like, I don't think that's a good solution for the general population. And so then that's where we start talking about like, well, do we need regulations on some of this stuff? And then you get into just a minefield of issues there, depending on how you view some of that stuff. And
Right.
and I get it. I think it's a sticky situation of, well, what do you do? I think we're going to see some interesting stuff. In the UK, they recently did like, particularly for kids, they've done a watershed on food advertising. So food ads are not allowed to be shown before 9 p.m. Anywhere in the UK.
Interesting.
But the thing is like, those companies probably could have fought that policy harder, but they know that I'm pretty confident that they know that like most people aren't getting advertising from television sources anymore. It's through mobile applications and streaming services.
Right.
And so they're like, yeah, go ahead and do whatever, because we're just going to show our ads online anyways. So I know that they're working on some policies there, but it's still tough. The internet is well, as we know from a variety of other issues going on in the world, it's nearly impossible to regulate anything on the internet, right? And so
yeah. So sounds like a difficult problem, but I guess awareness is step one, right? To say like, listen, this is I'm being triggered here, to go to that fast food restaurant or whatnot.
Yeah. And then there's, we're trying to do things like looking at like, there's researchers right now that are looking at like, can you do literacy programs like in kids, for example, that help reduce their reactivity to food commercials. So and we've been looking at some of the different cues. One of our goals is to look at a variety of different cues on internet-based platforms in particular. And so like, I think there's gonna be stuff coming out in the future to help with some of this outside of regulation, where some of it could be education or different things like that to help. We're not there yet. And so I've had people ask me before with some of my stuff where we're looking at brain response to cues and showing like certain advertisements are effective or not effective. And somebody asked me one time, they're like, well, don't you think you're just, teaching the ad companies how to do this better or whatever? And I was like, man, they already know. Like,
You don't have to teach them, right?
yeah, they know. Like, I'm not describing anything that they don't already know. Like, I'm just putting it out in the public sphere where, they keep it internal or whatever. So
Makes sense. So exit question here. I'm going to ask you something, a difficult question. At least I think it's difficult. It's a bit controversial too. And that's in terms of, like you said, about public health messaging, right? In my mind, we seem to be having two competing messages that have occurred in the last few years, right? One message, which is tried and true, is the let's fight obesity message, right? Obesity is bad for you. Obesity can cause things like we talked about: high blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease, etc. And it's important to lose weight and overcome the obesity epidemic.
yeah.
On the flip side of that, more recently, there's been a big push, and I'm not sure it's a public health push, but it's definitely a public push in terms of, and I think an important one, of avoiding what's called body shaming, right? Avoiding in terms of being able to allow people to have a positive view of themselves and self-esteem, regardless of whether they're obese or not. And some would say that's being taken to extremes, right? In the sense that, like, you have health magazines with, on the covers would be an obese person there, and they're the cover model for that weight loss or health magazine. And so it's a balance. Understandably, it's a balance, right? But how do you achieve the balance, and how do you reconcile those two competing problems, I guess, as a public health person, or as somebody interested in public health, I guess?
Yeah. So one of the things is, yes, this is, you're just like full of like really easy questions. So I think more than just that, just more than just a cover model. I think there are groups of people that have pushed it even to the extreme of like, well, we should ignore weight at all costs, talking about it, dealing with it, like whatever. Just ignore it. And I don't think that is the it's like, well, let's just ignore all the data that we have. Let's just pretend like it doesn't exist. Like, I'm not trying to speak for them and say that is their position or exactly what they're trying to do, but we do have to acknowledge that weight is tied to health in some way, and so we do need to address it. I don't think that we have really great ways of addressing it, especially in like the medical establishment, right? There's just like, doctors aren't trained to deal with that. Doctors aren't trained to interview people, to go through motivational interviewing, to go over behavior change, to, like, doctors are slammed, like, and even more so with what's going on right now nationwide with COVID and stuff like that, right? It's like they don't have time to talk about all this stuff, and this stuff takes a while. Like, it takes a while to sit down with somebody and say, like, okay, what are your goals? Where's your health at? What are your goals? What are challenges for you? Like, what's difficult for you? What's easy for you? What like those, it takes a long time. And so in some regards, I do agree. Like, if you don't have a good solution for somebody, like if you can't point them in the right direction, then yeah, you probably shouldn't talk. Like, it's not helpful to anybody to go into a doctor's office and the doctor's like, hey, guess what, you're fat. And then they're like, what? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, well, what do I do? Like, what, how do I,
right.
How do I do
well, that we don't
that?
have an answer for
like,
but
I don't know, figure it out, go read a book or something, like, like,
right.
Yeah. So it's just like, that's not helpful to anybody. And so I totally understand where that position comes from, where like, if it's like, well, if you don't have the resources for me, don't talk to me about it. Like, I don't need to be reminded. Like, I already know. Like, I'm assuming most people know, like, that they should probably do something. They're just not sure what, and so that's where we see, like, well, okay, what do you do? And that part, I think, is where a lot of work needs to be done. Like, where it's like, okay, well, what do we tell people? What programs are available to people? What intervention strategies do we have? What will insurance cover? Where can doctors refer people to? And all of those types of things. And so yeah, so I get it from that standpoint. To just, but again, to just ignore the fact that it can be an issue, or to just say, like, don't don't ever talk about weight, I don't think is helpful dialogue. Especially from like a clinician and a researcher side, right? It's like, well, we need to address that and need to look at it. Yeah. So then on the same note, like there should definitely never be any shaming that goes along with that kind of stuff, right? Like I said, there's these very like negative tropes around individuals based off of, well, and it's not just body weight, it's a lot of image things, right? Like people just tend to judge people for a lot of things, and it's like, why are you doing that? Like and so like that should never, just to say like, well, if somebody has elevated weight or they have obesity or something like that, then they're lazy or they're funny or they're, like we put these like things on them that they're people, like they they're their own person. Like they're not like this like caricature that you're drawing. And so like, there's going to be people that are successful. There's going to be people that are not successful. There's going to be people that are one thing or another, right? Like we could go through the list. They're individuals, and that's where it needs to be addressed as like an individual problem. And so yeah. So on that end, it can be similarly like, well, rather than focusing on weight, what if we focused on diet in general? What if we focused on physical activity in general, right? Like some of these health behaviors, and take it off of weight so much and being like this optimal weight or looking a certain way or that. And so I do understand and agree with that side of things of like, let's be healthy to be healthy, not to look a certain way or be a certain way or have a certain personality or like whatever it might be. So
I think that's an important distinction. First of all, that there is a spectrum between, advising good health practices and stigmatizing people, right? And I think like it also goes down to what you talked about from the very beginning consistently, is that it's not just about appearance. Appearance is not the end goal here, right? It's overall health.
yeah.
So you can't ignore the problem, basically, but at the same time, you don't need to stigmatize it from an appearance perspective and attribute a lot of tropes and other negative connotations associated with it. I think that balance, I think, is super important. So no more questions about obesity, but one last question about you before we let you go. So this podcast is called Better Man Clinics, and obviously the idea here is to allow our guys that are listening to get better, become the better version of themselves. So most all of the experts we interview here obviously have reached a level of success in their personal and professional lives. And the question I always like to ask is, what's the secret to your success? How do you live your best life?
Yeah. So successful. No, I don't know. I guess it just depends what aspect. I think a lot of things come down to consistency. I'd say. So whether it's health or success in your career, like whatever it is, there's things you have to get good at. So there's some amount of discipline involved in there, right? Of like, okay, I get up, I work out every day. I do these things with my kids. I make sure to help my wife. Like I make sure to write every day. Like those things, like well, writing for me because it's part of my job. Not
I get it.
Yeah. But yeah, so it's like that consistency, that discipline of like, let's just make sure we do these things, even if it's not perfect every day. Like, sometimes like I'm in a workout and it's just like, this is not a great workout for me. I'm tired, I'm sore, like whatever, but I committed to doing a workout plan, so I'm going to do it, and I'll make it through. and then it might not be the prettiest workout, and it might not be the best feeling workout, but we'll get through because I committed to that, and so sticking to that. And I think that's the same thing with a lot of things, right? Like I committed to doing something at work, writing a paper, doing an interview, like whatever. Like I'm gonna stick to my commitment. When I had kids, I made a commitment to help take care of them and raise them and like being part of their lives or whatever, like, so right. Like, yeah. So I generally, I guess, say that.
I think that's great advice for sure for everyone listening out there. Dr. Masterson, thank you so much for your time and your great insights. And to all you guys watching and listening out there, thank you for joining. And remember our mantra here at Better Man Clinics: your best life is a journey and not a destination, and use every single day to get just a little bit better. We'll see you all next time.